Welcome to Aon at the Top, where I have the honor of interviewing some of the most distinguished executives, C-suite, and board members about their journeys and paths to success. I'm your host, Nicole Ward, the Senior Vice President of Sales at Aon. In this series, we draw out meaningful insights and candid perspectives on navigating to the top. At Aon, we help you make better business decisions by turning risk into resilience. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Aon's podcast series, Aon at the Top. I'm your host, Nicole Ward, the Senior Vice President of Sales for Aon. And in this series, I have the honor of interviewing some of the most distinguished executives, C-suite, and board members to draw out meaningful insights and candid perspectives on how they navigated their way to the top. At Aon, we help you make better business decisions by turning risk into resilience. Today, we get to welcome global legal trailblazer and C-suite strategist in tech and AI, Carolyn Herzog. Carolyn Herzog is a powerhouse C-suite executive with over 25 years of global experience leading legal and compliance functions at some of the world's most influential technology companies. Currently serving as Chief Legal Officer and Company Secretary at the public company Elastic, the search-powered AI company, Carolyn drives global legal... Can we start over? I'm so sorry. I just blew that. My apologies. Or just do a pickup with the bio. Carolyn Herzog is a powerhouse C-suite executive. Pickup. Carolyn Herzog is a powerhouse C-suite executive with over 25 years of global experience leading legal and compliance functions at some of the world's most influential technology companies. Currently serving as Chief Legal Officer and Company Secretary at Elastic, the search-powered AI company, Carolyn drives global legal, regulatory compliance, and public affairs strategy for a company at the forefront of AI-driven observability and cybersecurity. Before joining Elastic, Carolyn held top legal leadership roles at Arm Limited, the world's leading semiconductor IP company, and Symantec Corporation, the global cybersecurity leader. Her career includes transformative work across the U.S., U.K., and international markets, including her early legal work at Accent Technologies and a unique foundation in global development through the World Bank's Africa Department. Carolyn is a seasoned board member and industry advocate. She currently serves on the global boards of the Association of Corporate Counsel, the Business Software Alliance, and the Hispanic Foundation of Silicon Valley. Her work with organizations like CHIPS, Ladder Up, and the National Cybersecurity Alliance showcases her commitment to advancing women in law, technology, and policy. Named one of OnCon's top 10 global corporate counsel and an attorney that matters by Ethisphere, Carolyn is widely recognized for her innovative leadership, operational excellence, and influence on legal and AI ethics thought leadership. She has also been named one of the top 50 most powerful women in technology by the National Diversity and Leadership Awards, most influential woman in IP by World IP Review, received a Silicon Valley Business Journal C-Suite Award and an award for Distinguished GC by the Directors Roundtable. Amazing background and career, Carolyn. So grateful to have you here today. I barely got all of that out.
It was a lot and yeah, slightly intimidating for me to hear you say it all, but thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I would love to start off with the personal journey, the beginnings, if you will, that sort of sparked your career and obviously the growth and incredible, accolades that you've had along the way. Can you take us back a little bit, to where that roadmap came up, originally for your career, or has it been just sort of, by design or ad hoc along the way?
Well, it's definitely not by design. I think there's a nature and nurture of how people get into roles and how you lead. I'll harken back. I just finished doing one of those Storyworth books about my mom, and I loved reminiscing about when, any of us had a question growing up. My mom would say, go look it up. And now we look it up, of course, on the internet or in our chat GPT, but we really had to do the research. And so I think that I was just raised to be curious, and I was raised to be self-sufficient in finding answers for myself. Certainly my career in law was not something I had planned on growing up at all. I was a French and music major, undergraduate. In fact, I visited my parents recently and they still looked at me and said, but aren't you surprised? And I said, at this point, for the amount of time I've spent in this career, I am not surprised, but it was not where I started out at all.
That's a really interesting that the difference between sort of French and that artist piece compared to kind of where you've ended up, or maybe it's not, right? Maybe there's more underpinnings there. But I love hearing that. Were there moments throughout your either youth or early career that really shaped the bigger course of your career?
I think the themes that kind of sit out for me in terms of who I am and what drives me is one, I have to be interested. If I'm interested in something, I just want to keep going at it. And I think when you really seek happiness and you seek, I kept reading, what color is my parachute earlier in my career and trying to figure out when was I going to get hit by lightning for what was that one thing that I'm supposed to do. I was waiting for somehow the heavens to open up and tell me what I was supposed to do. Because I think the ambition was always there. The curiosity was always there. I was always interested. And maybe this is the French in music. I think I wanted to be interesting. And so, that's how you end up meeting people and talking about what their careers are and learning about other people. And ultimately, when I started off my career, I kept looking at people saying, well, gosh, they seem really interesting. Maybe I should go find out more about what they're doing. And so there were a couple pivotal moments in my career. One was quickly when I was asked to move to London for my job. And my boss called and asked if I wanted to do this. And I said, yes. And they said, well, maybe do you want to ask your husband? And I was like, oh, he wants to go. So I'd say I'm pretty lucky in terms of like how I've selected my partnerships in life. And being up for that kind of adventure and risk was definitely one moment that was pivotal. I was always interested in everything international. And so the opportunity to work in another country, I had studied in other countries before, but to really spend that time and to go with my family was phenomenal. And the other big pivotal moment was taking my first GC role. And I say the first, I ended up being GC maybe because I was last woman standing a little bit in the first tech company that I worked in. And it was an amazing experience because I just kept getting thrown more opportunities to do things. And when the general counsel left, the CEO said, well, you can be general counsel. It was not maybe the way a public company would have done things today. That was a public company, but it was before Sarbanes-Oxley. And I felt very ill-equipped to take on that role. And I almost look back on it and say it wasn't a real GC role. When I took the GC role at ARM, that was a real GC role. And that was it was a really transformational company. It was a company that was going through a lot of change. It was very global in nature, British company owned by a Japanese conglomerate. And there were lots of new challenges and new things that I wasn't yet prepared for, but had to learn my way. And so those things that really teach you how to, overcome your own fears and to surround yourself with people that can help you be successful were really pivotal for me.
That's very interesting on the second example, like you say, surrounding yourself with others that either have strengths that you might not, or can hold you accountable or give you the support that you need and the mentor and the guidance, right? It's that team. But that's interesting, very interesting. And if you were to look back and pick a fail, I'll sidebar. I think with everyone that I've interviewed on the show, I always ask the question about, what was your biggest fail? And I predicate it with saying how my grandmother often said that poop makes great fertilizer. And so from great things come from failure, or can certainly, if we choose often to see them that way. So I'd love to hear if there was a face plant that you did that ended up being very meaningful or that later you're really grateful for.
Yeah, it's hard to pick just one. And I think one of the things, I like the way your grandmother described it. My grandmother was more like very refined and delicate, and she would never have said anything like that. But but certainly it is one of the things that we talk about a lot in business, right? That you can't find success without learning from failure. And at the time, and initially, and going from sort of the music and French to law, lawyers are really not known for, figuring out, like, failing well. We really like to be right. And so there's a different kind of training there. Whereas like if you miss your line in a play, you kind of, if you're good, you just make up another part of the line and get back on track. And that's considered a win. So, one fail that I think of often is that when I'd first taken that job in London and I had a team that was feeling very devalued, not motivated. The lead business partner in the region, who had the whole Europe, Middle East, Africa region. When I first called, and I said, "How is the team doing?" He said, "Fire everybody and start over." And that certainly would not have been my style, and certainly it didn't seem like constructive criticism that I could work on. And from there, once I moved, would continually send notes to my boss at that point saying like, pointing out everything that was wrong with the team. And I spent some time really trying to understand the team and what they were doing, and then started to defend them and say, no, but that's wrong, and that's wrong, because they're doing this, and that's right. And my boss one day wrote back to me and said, perception is reality. And I'd written a very, very long message defending all the things that we were doing that was right. And he just wrote those 3 words back to me, which frankly kind of infuriated me at the time. I was like, so unfair, didn't listen. I had to take a train and a bus back home, from work. It was a good hour. And then I got home and started yelling at my husband because naturally he was partially at fault for whatever had happened. And by the time I took that same train and bus back the next morning, I kind of digested it and thought, he's right. And I need to stop trying to prove that I'm right or that my team is right. And I need to take the perception of this person and I need to change. And I need to, it is the reality. If this person thinks this way, that is how they think. And I think that's just true in so many circumstances. It's so true in terms of how we see failures to listen today when people are on different sides of an issue. And it really helped form me into a much better leader because I stopped trying to be right all the time. It happens sometimes. But I try to be a better leader to say, well, what's the perception and why do they feel that way?
It's so wise. And I think there's a part of all of us. Certainly, I know early on in my career that really resonates and lands with, right? Like that need to be right versus leaning into with curiosity,
Yeah.
and recognizing that it is about perception and having compassion or empathy for someone else's perspective. That's a great lesson to learn early on. And it also takes a willingness to be vulnerable, right? There's a big jump there, but once you get it and you know it, you can't not know it. So it's very powerful. And it kind of leads into my next question, which is, how would you say that your personal values and sort of your personal beliefs have shaped your career choices and your leadership style?
So one thing is that I find myself talking about integrity quite a lot and sort of what does integrity mean? And to me, it's really about being true to yourself, but also being transparent and honest. And I think about when I first got married or I was, first with my husband today, we had a long conversation about like, if you eat the last cookie, you just got to say you ate the last cookie. And in his family, maybe they were just really polite with each other. And they were like, the cookie must have been eaten by a mouse. And I feel like to build trust, particularly in a leadership role, you have to be honest. You have to admit your mistakes. You have to admit when you don't know. To get people to give you the information that you need to make an educated decision in the timeline that you need it, you need to practice curiosity, even when it seems like something that is not very interesting at first. Figure out what are the points that you need to consider and be honest and transparent. So integrity and curiosity to me, as well as I'd say kindness. I think earlier in my career, I worked with a lot of people, or I've still seen things where people aren't necessarily treating others with dignity and respect, being kind when they could be, and they use intimidation instead. I'm almost 5 feet tall. I'm a woman. Like I'm in a big role where I maybe don't stereotypically look the role. And I'm also from Wisconsin. And so I like to think some of that Midwesternness is rubbed off on me. But I think you can be honest even when you're giving bad news to somebody, even when you're delivering difficult news, and still be kind.
I think there's so much, again, so much wisdom there. Where do you think all that comes from for you? Where did that? Who was the inspiration for sort of those values and that frame of thinking?
That's a great question. I mean, I credit my parents and my family for that. I grew up with a sibling that had some significant mental health issues, and so I think when you grow up in an environment where you're around people that are seeking kindness when it maybe isn't always the obvious choice, and who also fundamentally believe in equality and fairness and justice. I used to work on a lot of political campaigns with my mom, who was very into environmental issues when I was young, and we were very into civil rights and social justice kinds of issues. So I was trained very early on to have the conversation at the table. We had real conversations at our dinner table, and to learn to be patient and kind when I didn't always feel like that was my initial reaction and how I wanted to respond. And so, creating that kind of inclusive environment, creating an environment where if you disagree, you have to find a constructive way to say so, is really formed a lot. I have to admit, and in terms of how I feel about my values today.
That's such great architecture to build on, right? It sounds like some great experience and great guidance, like you said, from your family and your parents early on. Um, in pivoting slightly, when I think about your career and the bio that I just gave about you, those accolades, those accomplishments, the incredible career that you've had don't come without sacrifice. Um, what sacrifices have you made to get where you are?
A lot. And I think one of the big things that as women leaders today, we kind of have to stop and ask, you know, does does everybody in every generation have the same sacrifices that we gave? And the same is true of the people that preceded me. And I think that when I look back, I have two kids. One's a sophomore in college, one graduated from college last year. And I often tell people I'm trying to create a more equal environment where we all can spend time with our families and prioritize the work that we have. And I think there were times when my husband stayed home with our kids that I told myself I had to stay till 9 o'clock. I had to finish this next thing. If I don't do this, we're going to be homeless. Like, I just had all this fear that I didn't need to have. I had great bosses. I really have been very lucky that you know, with the exception of a short stint in fast food, I really have had very supportive, good bosses who have helped me along the way. And yet, my inner voice, the imposter in me said, no, I have to do more. I have to be more. I have to show that I'm here. And actually, I probably could have gone home for dinner every once in a while. And I talk to my kids about this a lot, and I try to talk to other parents today because you don't get time back. And I feel like I've been a very present parent, so I certainly had some things that I wasn't willing to sacrifice, but I question sometimes if I really had to sacrifice all the time that I sacrificed to be at work earlier in my career, if I could have gotten it done and showed up at home a little bit more too.
I think that's fair. It's trade-offs, right? And I appreciate your honesty on that so much. And I wonder, when you think about the mentors you've had, and then clearly the mentor I'm assuming you must be to others. Was there guidance that you got along the way? About time and sacrifices, et cetera. And then how do you coach those that are coming up underneath you to be mindful of some of those things?
I think the questions on time and how, I mean, we talked a lot for years about work-life balance, and now we kind of say, well, that doesn't really exist. It's work-life integration, and how do you prioritize things? I didn't really have these kinds of conversations with my bosses, as I was coming up. It wasn't, and so it's really something that I'm talking about more today. But I definitely had some mentors and mentors in my bosses as well, who are people you look at and say, you think about what is mentorship, right? And it's sort of where people that have the experience to help guide you. And I had a boss in particular, my boss who was the GC at Symantec, the same one that gave me the gift of perception as reality. I think we came at our experience from very different angles. He's more of an introvert. I'm more of an extrovert. He was somebody who encouraged me to take some chances and do other things when I maybe didn't have the courage to do that, or I really felt like I don't know anything about that. Why would I do it? And so being around people who see things in you that you don't see in yourself and who are also willing to call you out when you're missing the bar. I think the same with my CEO at ARM. It was the first time I was working for somebody who wasn't a lawyer. He was an engineer that became a CEO, and we're speaking a different language, and I had different needs, and yet this was somebody who really always did the right thing, really led with integrity. And I learned from that person, you actually don't have to sacrifice integrity to be successful. And so I've been fortunate that I've worked for people who I actually would consider to be mentors, even though they never would have formally defined themselves as such.
And, if you were to put your sort of leadership and, hat on now for this next question and think about how you make really difficult decisions when the stakes are really high and there's not a lot of time, what is that like for you? And what are your sort of, what's the framework that you use?
Yeah. And so I love Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've read his work, but I just
love Malcolm. Absolutely.
I think, yeah. So some of the things that he writes about, which is about how quickly we make decisions about things from our gut, really resonated with me, because typically a lawyer, when I've done all these personality tests and things, I often get, you're kind of a little bit different on the profile, because I am more people oriented than many lawyers in my position. I very much value the input of people, and I get my energy from people. That's part of the extroversion. And I also know that I tend to go with my gut. And so I will tend to make a decision pretty quickly. And I know that I can't make a decision or I can't make the conclusion unless I validate the facts. And so I really try to surround myself with people that are superb at being the subject matter experts, then get the facts. And I know how to ask the questions to get me the facts that I need in time to make the decision. My gut leads a lot on what is the right thing to do. And that goes back to the integrity and the curiosity and just having all of the experience. But when the stakes are high, you really need to understand, where do you go fast and where do you actually need to slow down to get some facts before you go fast? You've got maybe need to do everything, and then you can send people in a spin or really make a big mistake. And so being able to quickly validate what are the key facts and things that you need to know that are going to influence your path towards decision making, or maybe you make a series of decisions to get somewhere, then that makes a big difference. Also, having worked in other countries, the cultural nuances and how culture impacts law are always top of mind for me, because I know that I come at things as an American and how I've been trained in law in the United States. I would say employment law is the least intuitive because it's so driven by culture. And there's so many things that you may think you can do or shouldn't do because of where you sit or how you've been trained. It's part of your growing up. All of us that watch all the U.S. American TV shows and true crime, and this is like, they should absolutely go to jail. Of course, they're guilty. You have to kind of question your judgment based on culture and how might the law differ in the different countries. So I really enjoy cross-functional and cross-geographical questions, because coming at the right answer, there's so many laws on the book that directly conflict with each other, right? That say, like, if you do this in this country, it's going to be completely conflicting with what the law says over here that you can't do.
So much complexity and nuance, right? Which is part of probably the challenge and the excitement of it. I can really appreciate that international piece. And I wonder, to pull on that thread a little bit more, if there is a specific example that you could share of a time when, you needed to make. It was a big decision. There was risk on it. But, you came out the other side and there was a breakthrough there, or there was some, there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Yeah. Maybe not a pot of gold, but learning. And the first thing that comes to mind is the pandemic. because it's such a shared experience with all of us. I think everybody can relate to it. And when we first started tracking what was happening with the pandemic, and then made the realization that we need to send everybody home from work and we need to work remotely until this passes. And we need to give people the information and the resources that they need to do their jobs. That happened, if people think back, like very quickly. And now I'm sitting at home. I work in a company that's distributed by design. I've continued to work remotely for the most part. I can go into an office, but at the time, I was in the office every day, and most people were in the office every day. And we traveled a lot and felt that travel was critical to getting our jobs done. So pivoting very quickly and making a decision, a high-risk decision to say everybody's got to go home now and not come back into this office. When you needed people to come into the office, when would that be? What kinds of resources do people need? How much should we spend on giving people resources? And then also recognizing that the workplace had dramatically changed overnight. You've got people who are all by themselves working remotely and have no social outlet. You have people that are worried about their parents and their grandparents and their cousins and can't get to them. You have people that have a nice office to work in, like you and I right now. And there's people, I remember talking to people who were sitting on their kid's trundle bed in a tiny little room or sitting in a corner with multiple people. So you had to think about how long can these people actually sustain working like that? There were people that had young kids who they were suddenly schooling at home. And that made a big difference. So you also had to think about, well, what kind of flexibility am I going to give to people so that they're not going to completely burn out during this time while still getting the outcomes for the company that we need to achieve. And there were so many what ifs that just kept coming up, and we had to be highly communicative, really together as a leadership team on executing the strategy, being able to tell our customers and partners and the street about what we were doing. So that, I think that's a shared experience that we all have and could relate to, and saying like, what did I do at the time, or what did I experience that helped me get through that?
Yeah, it was an incredibly challenging time for everyone across the board. And you're right. Speed and working things out on the fly was a big part of that. I also know, as a chief legal officer, obviously risk is something that you think about regularly, and I'd love to know how you balance sort of risk mitigation with innovation and big thinking, right? Balancing that can be a challenge a little bit, right? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Can be, particularly because you will have people maybe that are less experienced and haven't taken big risks before, or haven't really looked at things from the strategic lens. We throw around the word strategy and big thinking as though we all have a common framework for that. But what does it really mean? And to me, it starts with, one, being really clear about the definition of the problem and the opportunity, right? So you can't know how to get somewhere if you don't know how to go. And I used an example recently. I was in the Netherlands, and as I hadn't been there in a while, and I was about to cross the street, and my colleague quickly grabbed my shirt and jerked me back while a stream of bicycles just fled by me. And I immediately thought, that is the difference between speed and velocity. Like, those people know where they're going, they know how to get there, they have their destination, and nothing is going to get in their way. And, there's a lot of people that go fast, but maybe didn't know what direction they were going in. Or if you have 6 people, spinning something really quickly, but you haven't put them all in the same direction, they're not going to go with velocity. And big thinking to me means we use all the cliches, thinking outside the box. But how do you get there? And this is where diversity and inclusion comes into play for me. Because if I have a certain mindset and I think I understand the problem and I think I understand the outcome and I'm ready to go with velocity, but I haven't brought in the considerations of people that look at that from a different lens, or may have a new idea that is the most brilliant thing, but completely not in my realm of understanding. It's really important, if you're going to think big, to make sure that you have the right voices in the room and that you're actually spending the time to think, to listen to them and to seek to understand. Because initially, a big thought may sound like that's impossible. Did we think we would be, driving electric cars or sending people into space the way we are today? And there's just things that would never happen. You wouldn't get that that fast train, the bullet train, if you didn't get other people thinking about the what ifs again. What if we tried it this way? And you see that sometimes with kids when they're putting together a Lego set or, trying something that's completely new, and you think like that was really creative. I don't know if it'll work, but it involves some big thinking because they're more willing to listen to each other.
No, I love that risk versus calculated risk, right? Or that the speed, the difference in speed and velocity. I think that really lands and that makes a lot of sense, right? And like you say, and you've alluded to this a couple of times, but it is diversity and inclusivity when you're willing to have yourself disrupted by other views of people that think differently than you do that are sitting at the table, right?
Yeah.
Welcoming that, I think, is so important, right? Yeah, no,
I
I really, yeah. Sorry.
I also think, part of it with risk, and one of the things I think that we have to practice is that you actually have to have a framework for talking about it. And you have to understand your audience. So if you're working in a company like I do, and you know that there's certain outcomes that we're trying to achieve, you have to be able to understand, well, how much risk am I willing to take? So often in law, people think it's black and white. And there are some lines that you just don't cross. Certainly in law, that's the same, but there's a lot of gray area. And risk plays a lot in gray areas too, because you start with sort of the phrase, there is a risk that, and then you have to decide, is that a risk I'm willing to take to get that outcome? How likely is that risk going to happen? What are the factors that would play in that would lessen or greater that risk from happening? How can I mitigate it enough so that I feel comfortable? And how would I pivot if the risk became so great that I needed to change direction? So truly successful organizations, I think, not only create the space for that big thinking and trying something new. We wouldn't get these great disruptive technologies or these innovative ideas if you didn't have the big thinkers in the room and the people that said, yeah, but maybe there's a better way of getting there, or maybe there's certain limitations to this, or what if we try it this way? And you talked earlier about making mistakes. How do you get people comfortable with making an educated mistake? There's mistakes that people make from just not paying attention and not asking questions, or not looking when you're about to cross the road and you're supposed to look the other way for the bicycles to come. Those are uneducated risks. But a calculated risk saying, well, I don't see any bicycles and the light is red and I think I could run this fast to get across the street and I'll get there faster. I was just advocating breaking the law, but you get the sense
I
of
won't tell
like,
anyone.
there's the Mae West line about it's okay if you crack a few laws now and then as long as you don't break any. I mean, the reality is, in a global environment, you're going to crack a few. Doesn't mean directly cross. I'm not advocating jaywalking, just for the record, but it is important to understand. Yeah, I see that risk and I'm willing to take it, and I feel educated enough to take that risk because the outcome is worth the reward, and I'm going to do all these things as we go along and pay attention. So having a risk framework, understanding, where you're working as a team, where's the company willing to go on this risk, and what are we going to do to pile together to try and limit the risk exposure.
Yeah. And, as chief legal officer for Elastic, a public company, what are some of the risks that you all are facing today? I mean, if we think about all of the stuff going on, emerging risks, cyber, AI, geopolitical uncertainty, all the things, what are some of the risks that Elastic's facing, and how do you prioritize them?
The risks that we face is just like any company in a dynamic space is competition. And how do you differentiate yourself and make sure that you are actually not just working on something that you think is super cool and super innovative, but actually something that the industry needs? And so how do you design and develop something that the industry needs? How do you get it to market in a way where that speed to market is really important, making sure it works so that you maintain customer trust and integrity with the work that you're producing? Obviously follow the laws and make sure that you are compliant, because it's not only that we want to be compliant, but our customers expect us to be compliant and need that to get that exponential growth. And when you're dealing with technologies as disruptive as artificial intelligence, there is so much good, so much potential to make us all more efficient, more effective, more knowledgeable. And then there are a ton of risks. There's risks that we're being informed by false information. So how do you provide assurance around the information? One of the things about Elastic that I find really, powerful is that, we're an enterprise company and our customers are using us in their own environment. So while we partner with the LLMs and while we're able to leverage search and AI in a speedy way so that customers are getting the information that they need at scale and in time, they're using it without the risk of the hallucinations that you might get if you're searching the whole internet. So that integrity of the data and making sense of it and being able to comply with data privacy laws around the world and honoring some of the cybersecurity risks creates for a lower risk environment to be able to rely on that data.
And how or what advice would you have for folks that are aspiring leaders? I'd like to think that a good portion of our audience are folks that are aspiring to the C-suite or aspiring to be on boards, et cetera. What advice would you have for them in terms of prioritizing very risky situations and things that are very high stakes?
Well, one is to lean into the understanding, right? And when it comes to aspiring to be a C-suite or in the board, I think it's a great aspiration, but it's not an aspiration in and of itself. I mean, I remember meeting so many people early in my careers that said, I'm going to go be a partner at a law firm and I'm going to make a ton of money. And those are not today necessarily the happiest people that I've met. So the people that continue, and we've kind of been talking about this throughout, the people that lean in with curiosity and interest, if you're genuinely interested in helping with a solution, if you're genuinely interested in helping a company scale, you're going to reach those upper echelons. If your goal is to help people and to lead through change, you're going to make it there. And risk is a great way to lean in because nobody wants to be standing at the podium by themselves. We, as leaders, as C-suite leaders, as board members, the buck always stops with you. You are accountable for the outcome. You are accountable for the mistakes, whether or not you knew it was happening or not. So it's one thing I think is really important to understand, that when you are in the C-suite, when you're at the top, everything that happens, whether it was directly within your organization or within another organization, is your problem. And you have to be accountable to that and you have to lead through that and you have to help people. At the same time, if you were making every decision in the organization, you're not enabling that innovation. You're not enabling that growth. So for people that are trying to get there, it seems really simple, but asking if you can help and asking if you can take on some of that responsibility and being an effective communicator about what you'd like to accomplish, what you'd like to do to help, people notice. People don't notice as much somebody that says, I want to be the C-suite, but they do notice the people that says, I'd really like to help you with that. Those are the people you always want on your team. Those are the people you always want to give more responsibility to.
Absolutely. I think that's great. In terms of the overall legal profession, right? I'd love to get your thoughts on just how you see things having changed, right? Since you started and where it's going. Any insight there?
I think one, you could think back and think about the stereotype of the lawyer holding the briefcase, wearing the suit, answering the tough legal questions. And I think the lawyers of today, particularly in-house, are business leaders. And I offer this because it's one of the more disappointing things about law school that I think is missed, is that people go to law school and go on to do so many interesting things. They could work in government, they could work in business, they could work in a law firm, they could work in public policy, they could work in a nonprofit, they can work in international organizations. So if you think of yourself today where it's really changed more as a business leader that looks at things through a legal lens, I think you'll find more leaders of impact. When I first started practicing, somebody would come in and they'd ask you a question and you give them their legal answer. Today, I remember a situation once at a company where they were having a conversation about some issues in a particular region, and they said, "Well, it's not legal, so you're okay." And I said, "No, I really think I should be there." And they said, "No, it's really not legal, and it's a small room." And I said, "Well, I'm a small person," and I ended up sitting on the desk so that I could be in that room. And almost every question ended up coming to me, and still feel a little smug about that meeting. But the key is if you lean in and you offer business solutions, it doesn't have to be about the law. The law should be incorporated into that. But if you're seen in the C-suite as a leader of the business and not somebody who's leading a function to give a narrow answer, you can be much more impactful.
I think that's such sage advice, because I think we can, especially in bigger corporations, feel, and as a corporate citizen myself for many years, I think we can experience that sense of silo or like, well, this is mine, to impact, to drive, as opposed to really looking across, the business and that empathy even for all of the other pieces that create the
Yeah.
whole. And I think I think that's really, I think that's great advice. And is there a trend or something that you're really excited about that's going on right now that's either affecting your business at Elastic or just beyond, right? Just within the profession. Anything you're really excited about or concerned about?
Yes and yes. So one trend that is concerning but also exciting, 'cause I think there's an opportunity, right? There's no better role than the legal role to deal with crisis and to deal with change. To be able to make decisions in the fly, to help lead people to speak with confidence. And we are dealing with a tsunami, I keep saying, of regulation right now from around the world. We're seeing this kind of quid pro quo. We're seeing a lot of siloed activity. We're seeing a lot of sovereignty questions. And, you know, global businesses are meant to be global. They are meant to scale on a global basis. And we've gone through this huge time of saying, oh, we're one world. You're dealing with all of this cross-border engagement, opening up. You've got the European Union, obviously, that was framed, and that creates a whole legal framework around how do you work through different countries. And now we're seeing some of this reversion back to which countries are safe. AI and technology generally doesn't scale for one region. And so you need to have that ability to scale globally. You need to be able to work globally, and you need to be able to take all of these laws and navigate through all that complexity and say, here's where we should go. Here's how we build customer confidence. Here's how we're going to be compliant. Here's how we're going to be a trusted advisor. And that's a really challenging issue for lawyers today. And it's also a big opportunity to stand up for the doing what's right part of complying with the law and recognizing there's going to be areas that are going to be confusing and a little bit murky.
Interesting. And when you think about success and how you measure success and whether or not you are successful, financial metrics aside, what does all of that look like for you?
It's, as I'm leaning towards the latter part of my career, I think about this a lot. Similar to sort of, you asked me earlier, thinking back, like, what did I regret? And, my mother will always say you shouldn't live with regrets. But the reality is you have to recognize what would you have done differently to help change the world for the better. And to me, I really like this. I don't know if you've seen it, this philosophy. It's a Japanese philosophy called ikigai, and it literally translates to being the meaning of life. And it really speaks to me because success is when you accomplished from a professional standpoint, what you wanted to accomplish, and maybe even more. You still feel curious. You still feel satisfied with what you've achieved, and it also means that you're happy. I know so many people that have sought out making the most money, making the biggest title, but they never stop to think about, well, am I really interested in this? Am I passionate about it? With Ikigai, you get that sense of like you have work that's meaningful and has purpose. You have people that you love and who love you. So family is a huge part of my happiness, and friends are a huge part of my happiness. Having interests outside, like I'm still very passionate about music and art, and like I like saving time for that. I want to see the world, and I love that I get to travel for my job, but I also travel personally, and that I live with someone who wants to travel with me. So success is very holistic, and it is all based on the things that are most important to you. And as I get older, maybe I'm also incredibly sentimental. You can even see from all the stuff on my wall there that I like to save memories. I like to cherish those memories, and I'd like to think that the people along the way that I've met, maybe have helped a few along the way, and that they'll remember me always as somebody who was nice and helpful.
And because I was going to ask you about what you want your professional legacy to be, but I could see where some of what you just shared kind of parlays into that. But is there anything from a professional perspective that you'd like your legacy to be? Again, you've got a lot of runway left, but just out of curiosity.
Like professionally, I really would like to be known as somebody who acted with honesty and integrity. Again, the kindness factor weighs in, and that I help other people achieve what they wanted to achieve. To me, one of the most rewarding things is to be in a position where I've learned a lot through my career. I've achieved more than what I thought I was going to achieve when I started out. And to be able to lean in and help others find their path is really an extremely rewarding part of what I spend time on today.
Love it. And you've spent obviously your career in tech and AI. So I wonder if there's a societal impact that you hope can be made in that space, right? What's the big impact that you'd like to see?
Yeah, I often say that AI isn't going to replace humans. It's going to replace humans that aren't using AI. And we are using AI in ways today that we often don't even recognize. We're using facial recognition to open up our phones. When we go to the doctor, they've got data that's being analyzed by AI so that they can come to a conclusion faster. There's that human element that is the oversight of that, which I think is really important in mitigating risks around AI. But the use cases are becoming more and more. We know that AI is being used in predictive analytics to be able to predict climate change issues or issues that are, relating to our personal health. And so I think that we will continue to see massive advancements in the use of AI. I also think it needs to be controlled in a responsible way so that it's not unintendedly misused. Cybersecurity is one of those areas that comes to mind where there's the great stories about, well, a device was designed to test the temperature in the water in a fish tank, and hackers hacked into the system by hacking through that device. It wasn't designed for cybersecurity. It was designed to keep the water clean and the water temperature correct. But if you don't think about cybersecurity when you're developing an AI system, then you can create ultimate vulnerabilities. So I think there's just tremendous potential. I also think AI, one of the factors that we think about a lot in frameworks around responsible use of AI is the future of jobs. And while all of us may not be responsible for saying it's not just about training the next generation of engineers that are going to use AI, I really hope it's going to help shorten, and make smaller the digital divide, that it's going to create access and opportunity to people that otherwise don't get it. I hope that it's going to be something that from an economic perspective will bring people closer together. We have a huge economic divide in our country and in many countries. And I also think from a knowledge factor, it's going to be able to give access to knowledge to people that otherwise would not have access. Now, that needs to be, again, with integrity. You need to be able to rely on that data to make decisions. And I think we have a long way to go to make sure that AI is used responsibly in that way.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And, I wonder, in terms of your own blind spots, right? I believe we all have blind spots, right? There's what we know, what we know we don't know, and then all the things that we don't even know, we don't even know. And I wonder, how do you blind spot yourself? How do you see around corners? How do you figure out what your blind spots are?
Is network, right? And so when I first moved to the UK, I didn't know what I didn't know. I was very much in that blind spot. And so somebody might tell me, you can't do that in Germany. And I would think intuitively, like, well, of course you can do that in Germany. Like, everybody has to do that. Why can't you do that in Germany? It just didn't make any sense. And so surrounding yourself with people who can give you information and advise you in a way that you trust and that you can have debate on, and to validate things that are just not intuitive to you or that you can't see, is really important. And I think that's true both internally and externally, making sure your conversations internally. And in the end, I'm a team player anyways, but I'm also the person that has to make the decision. And sometimes I have to make it quickly. And so making sure that you have those subject matter experts to say, what am I missing? Is there something here? Being able to ask the question, that's the biggest part of leadership, is, to me, knowing who to ask to say, am I missing something? I I have kids that are, well, no, now they're not teenagers, they're 20 and 22. So during the teenage years, I thought it was the ultimate gift of being told everything that you're missing and have wrong. You kind of need people that you trust in the workplace that are also going to say, Carolyn, you're an idiot. You kind of missed this point that is really critical when it just wasn't obvious to you at all.
But it takes incredible vulnerability and willingness, which clearly you have, as we've spoken about, to be a receiver of that, to create a sense of safety and trust with those around you that they can give you that, and that it will be met with okay, thank you, as opposed to I really didn't want to hear that. So that's a kudos to
Yeah.
you for sure.
I think we often mix up vulnerability and weakness. And being vulnerable and admitting that you don't know everything doesn't mean you're weak. It actually shows leadership. The people who are afraid to
100.
admit that they have vulnerabilities and that they're, maybe went at that one too fast or that they missed something, people aren't going to feel safe to tell you what you're missing.
I completely agree. And from a content perspective, what do you consume? What podcasts, newsletters, writings, books? Is there anything? I know you mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, who's awesome, but is there any other go tos for you that the listeners might learn from?
Well, I'm a voracious reader, and right now, for instance, I find that there is so much news coming at us through various social media sites and others that it's really hard to consume the news and understand what you need to read or what you need to understand. So there's a few news sources that I really rely on. Axios, I think, is really important. I like The Week, which is a little magazine that gives you more of a global perspective. I like the BBC, I think a little more neutral. But just knowing you can't read everything, but you need to know where the source came from and, and how to rely on that. There's also a bunch of legal news sources that I get because you can get a newsletter from every single law firm in the world, but being able to rely on the news sources that you see. I personally also really like reading what my colleagues are thinking about. So I'm on the board of the Association of Corporate Counsel. It's the largest network of in-house counsel in the world, and I network with a lot of other GCs because there's the law, and then there's sometimes people that are ahead of that and saying, "Here's how we're dealing with that." That helps me move faster. So again, leveraging your network and reading what somebody else wrote, I look for those articles of interest to get me going. I also really just like reading. And so, a good fiction to take me away is always something that is on my plate. And I've got a stack of books, by my bed. I just finished James, which I thought was just an excellent sort of next story after Huckleberry Finn from a different perspective. And I like things that make me think about things in a different way.
I love that. We all need to think about things differently and be willing to be disrupted, right? So I love that. And so, final question for you here is: what did I not ask you that I should have asked you, or what other thoughts or final insights would you like to share?
This has been quite thorough and delightful, and so I can't think of anything specifically that you didn't ask me that's about leadership, but I could offer one thing in terms of like, well, how are you going to spend your summer? Because it's telling for how people spend their time. And so this summer, actually, my parents are coming in for a month, and my youngest is coming home this weekend. And I was just having a conversation with another colleague about how they were going to take a couple Friday afternoons off and spend some time with their kids when they were home. And it is trying to make up maybe for those things that I didn't do always as well as I thought I should have done in the past. And I'm really going to make sure that the time that I have when my family is all together is going to be really well spent time.
Well, it sounds like you're set up to really savor that. That is wonderful. Is there a place folks can find you, or if you're blogging or writing or LinkedIning, or is there any place that people can go to find you to follow you?
LinkedIning, that's a great word. Yes, I am. I
I just
am
made it up.
most of
I'm
my
sure I'll
social.
get in
Yeah,
trouble, but
good. It might be coined. So I spend most of my social media time on LinkedIn these days. That's where I put the efforts in, and I really enjoy hearing from others and reading what others are doing. And I do get a lot of news from LinkedIn. I think it's a great platform, and that's where I do spend my majority of my time there.
all right. Well, thank you so much for taking your valuable time and spending an hour here, and so many great insights and such great perspective from what's been a fantastic career that will continue to be so. So, thanks so much, Carolyn. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Nicole. It's been really fun.